But this is a large crowd, so I'm going to try to speak up so you can hear me, but we'll try to keep everybody together so we're not too spread out. But if you can't hear, just let me know, or if you need something repeated, ask me to say it again. But I'll try to be as loud as possible without breaking Ben's ears on their audio. But before we get started, any questions? Or I recognize some of you, but a lot of you I don't. So maybe some of you are fairly new to town.
Just moved here last summer.
Last July.
Oh, wonderful! Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And you're new back here too?
Yeah, 2 years we've been here.
Well, I appreciate you coming and wanting to learn more about McFarland's history. And as you might have noticed, tonight's tour is the early settlers and immigrants. August 1st, we're having another tour for the early business people and merchants and people like that. And then August 15th, another tour on various musicians and writers in the McFarland area who are buried here. And the last one will be on the Sunday of it used to be the Family Festival. I don't know what they call it now. It's still called Family Festival. So Sunday of Family Festival, right after the parade, the final walking tour will be about the veterans who are here. And here comes the last group of people. But the cemetery, I'll go into this later, but it's been here since late 1860s. But in 1920, 1921, a cemetery association was created through the Lutheran Church, and they kind of operated the cemetery at that time going forward. Before that, it was just the church, probably just the minister who took care of making sure the cemetery is taken care of and whatnot. But in 1978, the Lutheran Church and the Cemetery Association went their separate ways. And so the Cemetery Association now, since 1978, has been an independent organization. And so they control the whole cemetery. The church doesn't dictate who can be buried here or what. You don't have to be Lutheran to be buried here. Yeah.
Is there a name? Does the cemetery have a name?
It's known as the Lower Cemetery, McFarland Lower Cemetery, and the other one is the Upper Cemetery. Okay, great. And so I'll get started, but the first thing I want to do is to welcome you all here, but also to thank Sarah Hendrickson, the Adult Services Librarian, and the McFarland Public Library for helping me put this on and taking care of all the logistics. So I appreciate that.
We're happy that you're doing it for us, Ron.
And so, as you know, this tour is about the early settlers and immigrants. And it's fairly common knowledge that there are two types of immigrants to this area. Those who came directly from Europe in the 1840s, 1850s, and those who came from other states, mostly what they called the Yankees from Pennsylvania, New York, and New England. And there were some from Kentucky and other places, but those are the two main groups. But the main group I'm going to be focused on tonight are the Norwegian immigrants. And there's a reason for that. Not because I'm 100% Norwegian, but, but because this cemetery was started by the Norwegian Lutheran Church, which stood right here where you're standing. And it first was started construction in 1867. It took them several years to finally finish it. But while the church was here, they started burying people around it. And the first church, and so because it's a Norwegian Lutheran Church, all the services were in Norwegian at at that time. So you weren't going to have any Germans or any Yankees going to church here. And so the church controlled the burial ground, the cemetery, so only members of the Norwegian Lutheran Church could be buried here. So that's why you're going to see or hear about a lot of the Norwegian immigrants. There are two exceptions, and but we're going to talk about 10 families that were early immigrants to this area. But immigration to this area started really in the early 1840s. In 1843, the first white settler was in the town of Dunn. 1843, the first white settler was in the town of Pleasant Springs, and soon after that, it just kept growing and growing and growing. And the first Norwegian in the Pleasant Springs was 1843. The first Norwegian in the town of Dunn was 1844, and then it just kind of grew and exploded after that. The one thing about the Norwegian immigrants, the first official boatload of Norwegian immigrants came in 1825, but they settled in western New York. And it wasn't until 1836 until the next organized boatload of Norwegian immigrants came. And by that time, the New York settlers had moved to the Fox River Valley outside of what is now Chicago. And so that's where the 1836 people came, because the Norwegians, more than almost any group, went to where they knew people, because they were influenced to come here by letters from settlers who were already here. They would send letters home saying, "Whoa, America's a great place, you need to come." And they were called the America letters, and so that was kind of a pull to the immigrant to come. And then in Norway, the economic times were awful if you were poor and didn't own land. And so the vast majority of immigrants coming from Norway were poor non-landowners, and so they needed a better life. Even if your family owned land, if you were the second son, you were out of luck, because they had a law there, primogeniture, where the oldest son inherited everything. If you were the second or third or fourth son, you had to go out on your own and find work. And so a lot of them came over too. So that was kind of the pushing factor of getting the immigrants to leave Norway. And Norway is a beautiful country with mountains and fjords, but only 3% of the land is tillable, and only 7% of the land is used for pasture. So there's a very small amount of land that people can make a living off of. And the other problem was between 1750 and 1850, the population of Norway doubled, making it more difficult for people to find work or to make a living. And then it doubled again from 1850 to 1928. So the immigrants started flowing this way. And so we're going to learn about some of the early immigrants to this area. And we'll start over here. Well, here we have the monument for Helena and Ingebrit Johnson Helle. They were both born in the early 19th century, 1807 for Ingebrit and 1812 for Helena. And here you can tell they're Norwegians. It says Helena, kona of Ingebrit. Kona is wife of. And foot means born on June 17th, 1812, and døde means died. And so the early monuments, a lot of them have the Norwegian language on them. But they married in Nisadal, Norway, and they had 6 kids. They married in 1831. But here's an example of where Ingebrit received letters and promoting America. And so he thought it was time that his family should go, because with 6 kids and not much of a future, he thought America held the promise for his whole family. So they arrived in America in 1844, and they could only make it as far as Buffalo. And why they couldn't, I'm just guessing they didn't have the money to make it further. And so with 6 kids, trying to, if you can imagine taking 6 kids in a van and just driving to California nowadays would be a challenge. But then in 1844, taking 6 kids in a sailing ship that took 2 months to cross the Atlantic, it would have to take a huge toll on everybody in the family. But they made it to Buffalo. But Helena's had 2 brothers, Larson and Niels Mastra, and they had immigrated as well, and they made it out to the town of Dunn. And they were thinking, oh, this is great, the farmland is wonderful. So they knew how to get in touch with them in Buffalo. So they wrote letters to Helena and Ingebrit saying, you need to get to Wisconsin. And so finally, after 4 years or 5 years, they made it to the town of Dunn, where they bought some land. And they bought land south of here, just south of the Yahara River, on the other side of the Yahara. They bought land that stayed in their family well into the 20th century. So Ingebrit was interviewed by Svein Nielsen, who was the editor of Billed magazine, which was a Norwegian publication in the late 1860s, 1870s. And Ingebrit told about his voyage experience. And so I'll just read what he said here. I left Norway in April 1845, crossing the ocean on a ship, the Salvator, from Porsgrunn. There were, all told, 140 emigrants aboard. Many of us had received letters from friends who had left earlier, and since they praised America, we also decided to look for homesteads beyond the big waters. As far as I could gather, it was these encouragements from America that had persuaded most of the immigrants to bid old Norway farewell. The trip across the ocean was full of dangers. The fierce gales that we encountered on the Atlantic threatened us with death and destruction. The boat was loaded with iron, and during one fearful storm, the cargo got displaced, which nearly caused the ship to capsize. Even our experienced captain gave up hope of rescue. The terror and the cries of distress among the passengers were indescribable. After being tossed about on the ocean some 14 weeks, we finally reached New York Harbor in a miserable condition. Then our immigrant group began the trip inland. And so I think it's hard for us to imagine just what it took to be an immigrant in the 1840s. But they made it, and they had a good life. And as I mentioned, they had 6 kids, but once they were here, they had 6 more. And so they needed the farm hands, because being a farmer in the 1840s or early 1850s wasn't easy, because none of the land had been cultivated before. And so just trying to plow that land with the thick soil had to be quite a task. And many of these immigrants didn't have horses, but they had oxen, because the oxen were slow and steady, and they could do better than a horse pulling a plow. It wasn't until the land got plowed a couple of times that then horses were manageable for field work. But we're going to go across the way and talk about a friend of Ingebrit and Helena's. All right, our next family that we're going to talk about is Ole and Gunhild Deersen, or they went by Ole and Gunhild Knutson Deerland. Not Deersen, Deerland. We'll talk about Deersens later. But Deerland. And they came from Telemark, Norway. They were married in Norway, and they came in April 1843, which was pretty early for the Norwegians, but they didn't come here first. First they went to Muskego. And I mentioned about the New York Norwegians going to the Fox River Valley outside of what is now Chicago. That settlement proved to be not great, because in the springtime it was pretty wet and marshy, and there were a lot of mosquitoes, and they would get malaria, and a lot of the settlers died from the sickness. So they were looking for other places. And the first Norwegians to come to Wisconsin were in 1838, and that was in Rock County. But then soon after that, the first big settlement in Wisconsin was at Muskego, starting in the late 1830s. And so that's where a lot of the Norwegians then, after 1838, or between 1838 and 1843, came to Muskego. And it was just, again, more letters going out back to Norway and saying, come to Muskego. So that's where the ensuing boatloads of Norwegians came. But they soon found out that Muskego wasn't the greatest place either because, again, of mosquitoes and malaria. And so people were, and Muskego was getting kind of full, so people were thinking we need to go further west. And so they would send out like scouts to go further west in Wisconsin to see if they could find suitable land. And so several men from the Muskego settlement went out and found this area called Kashkanang. And so the Deerlands spent a couple of weeks in Muskego and heard about Kashkanang, and they thought, that's where we need to go. And so after 2 weeks in Muskego, they went west. And I have something here too that I should read about Ole Gun Hill's experiences, and this also was written in the Billed magazine. So this is from Ole Deerland. There was much talk of Kashkanang at the time. Many of the settlers had been west from Muskego to have a look at the land, and they came back with good reports. After staying 2 weeks in Muskego, I too decided to choose Kashkanang as my future home. That fall, many of the older settlers left Muskego to seek new land near the West Kashkanang Church in Pleasant Springs Township. I lived for 6 years on Kashkanang. Niels Mastra, one of the brothers to Helena Johnson, Niels Mastra and his brother owned much land in the neighboring township of Dunn, and when Niels offered to sell me part of it, I moved to my present place. At that time, the two Mastra brothers, Ingebrit, Johnson, Hella, and some Yankee families lived in Dunn Township. Ingebrit Johnson had arrived in the spring of 1849, while I came to Dunn in the fall of that year. Besides me, there were thus 3 Norwegian settlers living here. The next year, Hans Gudbrandsson Morkvolden from Numedal arrived, and still a year later, the population increased considerably because of immigration. And so, so it just started then. And in Kashkanang, I should explain, was a large area. It went down to Edgerton, Stoughton, Albion, Utica, Deerfield, Cambridge, and McFarland and Pleasant Springs and southern Blooming Grove were on the northwestern edge of the Kashkanang settlement. So it was a rather large area, and it became well known as a Norwegian community all through the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. Basically, it was Norwegian. That's why Stoughton is so Norwegian, and Deerfield and Cambridge, because of all the settlers. And the first Lutheran churches set up by the Norwegians were in Kashkanang, West Kashkanang and East Kashkanang. And so that's the McFarland area people, even though McFarland didn't exist at that time, but the people in Dunn and Pleasant Springs would go to Kashkanang, West Kashkanang for church once in a while, not often, because it's about 10 miles out there, and traveling 10 miles with no roads, you weren't going to go to church every Sunday. But if there was some special occasion, if there was a baptism needed or a marriage, then you'd go to church. And maybe Easter, I don't know. But and Ole Deerland's obit, it said that he was always a happy, contented fellow and could tell many interesting stories about pioneer days. And he died of lung fever and pneumonia. But it would be nice if his interesting pioneer day stories were written down, but they're lost now to history. But they had 2 daughters, Hattie, and she married Brick Dearson, who we'll meet later on, and then Julia, she married Peter Johnson, who was a well-to-do farmer in the town of Dunn. But there's one thing about Ole Deerland which is interesting. There was an article written in the Wisconsin History of Magazine of History in 1947, talking about a calendar stick that Ole Deerland brought with him from Norway. And he treasured that item like he treasured their family Bible and a hymn book. He treasured it so much he put it in their trunk to bring to America, even though the calendar stick was not going to be useful here because the seasons here were different, the growing seasons were different here than in Norway. But a calendar stick was a kind of an ancient way of telling about the seasons, when to plant, when to harvest, and it was a two-sided stick. One side was the summer and the other side was the winter, and then there were 26 notches on each side for each week, and then 7 little notches between the larger notches. And then there were some almost like hieroglyphics or some odd drawings on the stick that would have some meaning to whoever was creating that stick. And but so he thought it was so important that he brought it with him because it was passed down to him from his mother, and it was from his family a couple generations, so he didn't want to leave that behind. So that's one thing that he brought in his trunk. And it was of such interest to the Norwegians around here that several copies were made by Torbjorn Vik, who's actually buried over there. And we'll talk about him at the August 15th walking tour. But he made copies of this calendar stick. And one of the copies is in storage at the Wisconsin Historical Society, and another copy is in storage at Vesterheim Museum, the Norwegian American Museum in Decorah, Iowa. So it was really a valuable thing to the Norwegian immigrants, this ancient calendar stick. And so it was written about, many years after Ole died, but it's interesting to know that he thought it so valuable and others thought it was so valuable too. This is a picture. It's not a great picture, but it looks like a little sword kind of, or a yardstick with a handle. And you can't really see the notches or anything in it, but it's an interesting thing that he brought with him. And besides the hymnal and the Bible and the stick and other things that the family needed, he also packed his wife's spinning wheel in the trunk. So it must have been a fairly decent sized trunk. And now we'll just take a short walk over here. So the next person we're going to talk about is Gunhild Stondal. She was married to Bjorn, but I'm not going to say much about Bjorn. We're going to save him until August 15th as well. But Gunhild is his wife, and her full name is Gunhild Oldsdatter Bergland Stondal. But she was born in Telemark, Norway in 1827. And she grew up there, and she didn't immigrate until she was 22 years old. But the interesting thing about her is that her parents, at an older age, came here first. And then they probably wrote letters back home and convinced Gunhild to come to America as well. And so she did, and married Bjorn. But it's her father who's of special interest, Ole Bergland. And the reason why he is so interesting because he owned land, and he was educated, and he was a teacher in Norway. And that was really rare for a person like that, especially at his age, probably in his 50s, to decide to immigrate. But he did. And so he bought some land in Section 12 of the town of Dunn, which is just, you go down A.B. a little ways, and that's where his farm was. And so trying to figure out why he moved, no one can really tell. But his daughter followed him and got married and raised a family. And what's of interest with that is she had a son who became a state senator, and one of her daughters married a man from the area who was a longtime U.S. congressman. And so the early immigrants, Norwegian immigrants, didn't take long for them to make their mark, and their descendants taking positions of some importance. Another daughter married a man by the name of Torgerson, and their daughter, or Gunhild's granddaughter, married Walter Brandt, who is the son of the first full-time Lutheran minister in McFarland. And they're both buried over there. And then Walter got his PhD in history, and so Walter and Gunhild's granddaughter, Elisa, went to New York City and lived for many, many years because he was a professor at the City College in New York City. So just an example of how they came over on a boat that took 2 months to get here and struggled to farm and whatnot, but within a generation or two, their descendants were doing wonderful things. And now we'll turn to somebody who's not Norwegian. We'll go to William McFarland's. Well, if we're talking about early settlers and immigrants, we have to mention William McFarland, since he was here in 1856 and founded our community. But he has an interesting backstory and how he arrived and why he came here. Interesting monument, and there's a story behind that as well. But you can see it's Mary McFarland at the top, wife of William McFarland. This is William's first wife, and she died on April 1st, 1879. And so William wanted her buried here, but I'm sure they did not go to the Norwegian Lutheran Church because they did not speak Norwegian. And so how did William McFarland get to have his family plot here? Well, I'm guessing that, this land was owned by William McFarland. When he came to found the town, he bought 160 acres, and he owned all of it, and so he was selling it off to different people who wanted to set up shop here or to live here. And so when the church was started in 1867, I don't know if he donated the land to the church or if he sold it to the church, but he probably made a deal with the church at that time that he could have his family buried here. And that's why I'm guessing William McFarland and his family are here. But as I mentioned, Mary died on April 1st, 1879, and on September 1st, he married his second wife, Celia, or Sella, who was a Norwegian immigrant. And so in a way, William McFarland belongs here because his second wife was a Norwegian immigrant. But she brought with her 7 children. And it's really cloudy about William's first marriage, if he had any children or not. Some reports say he didn't have any. Other reports say he had 3, and only 1 survived. So we're not entirely sure. The surviving child was a daughter, possibly, according to reports, that got married and moved out east, and no one ever heard from her again. So it's hard to say. But William's backstory is that he was born in 1820, according to the tombstone. I've read reports where it says he was born in 1817 or 1821 or 1822. But we'll go by what was on his grave marker in 1820. And at a young age of 14, in 1834, he got a job on a ship, cargo ship coming out of England, heading to Charleston, South Carolina. And they were to pick up a load of cotton in Charleston and go back to England. But when they got to port, the captain found out that the cotton had been sent on another ship. So the captain didn't have any use for his crew, so he dismissed everybody. So here's William McFarland, 14 years old, in Charleston, South Carolina, and doesn't know anybody. And so he tried to figure things out, and he started working in the carpenter trade, learning things, how to be a carpenter. And he was there for 3 years. And every year he got sick, probably with malaria, or as they called it, ague, but terribly sick. And after the third time, he was fed up with that, and he said, I don't like this climate, I'm going north. And so he found his way up to New York State. And so if this would have been like 1837, and according to a report that I read, it said that he drifted from Albany to Buffalo, and I don't know what that means. But I think he was there in New York State for about 10 years, because he then showed up in Milwaukee, where he may have had a brother. And it says that he worked in the carpentry trade there for 3 years, which would bring us to 1850. And then at that time, the railroad was starting up in Milwaukee, the Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad. And he found a job with them. And so he was he was working on construction with the railroad. It said he built the first boxcar for the Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad. But eventually he was promoted to construction superintendent, which put him out on the road, where he oversaw the construction of railroad trestles and depots along the route that they were creating from Milwaukee to Madison. And after that was done, he said to the boss, I'm tired of being on the road. I want to have a job where I can be at home. And so that kind of lends you to think that he had a family in Milwaukee, but I'm really not sure. But so maybe he was married to Mary in Milwaukee, and maybe they had 3 kids and he wanted to be closer to them. We just don't know. But in any regards, the railroad had made it to Madison in 1854, and they had a depot not too far from here, about a mile or 2 east of here. They called it the Door Creek Station. And for some reason, that depot wasn't working out. Some reports say that the grade was a little too pitched, where the steam engines had trouble getting started again once they stopped, and they needed a flatter place. And so they offered William McFarland, the railroad offered William McFarland a chance to come here, buy this land, and start a depot, and be the station agent, and you can name it McFarland. And so that's what he did, and then built the McFarland House, which was completed in 1857. And perhaps that's when Mary moved here, and maybe with a child or 2. But we just don't know 100%. We just know that Mary died in 1879, and then Celia became his wife. And they had 3 kids, Celia and William, even though William was about 60 years old when he married for the second time. But he had 3 kids. William Jr. was the first one, but unfortunately he died when he was 10 years old. But then there were 2 more sons. And so the other interesting thing here is the monument. And it's iron. And so this was made by a company in Chicago. And on the side here it says Henry Dibley or Dibley. And that was the owner of this company. They made ornamental ironwork for various places. And so they had a contract to make 8 female statues that would go around the state capitol of Wisconsin, 2 on every entrances on each post at each entrance. But for some reason, the state only used 4, and so there were 4 left over. And somehow, William McFarland knew about those being in storage, and he thought this would make a great monument for his wife, Mary. And so he bought one. And according to the Wisconsin Historical Society, the name of this one is Candelabra. But the interesting about Henry Dibley is that he married Marshall Field's sister. So, interesting little tidbit there. Okay, now we'll just...
Can I ask a question then?
Yeah.
What is the importance of the sickle?
Is it just for farming or?
Yeah, and so she's holding a sheaf of grain or wheat under her left arm, like she just harvested something. And, she's looking, it's kind of like Miss Forward. She's looking off in the distance. And so I don't know what the other statues were or what pose they were making, but each one probably represented something different about Wisconsin's future or their progress or whatnot. And so farming would be, agriculture would be maybe what she represents. I don't know why she was nicknamed Candelabra, but all right. Okay, our next family that we're going to be talking about is the Sher Johnson family. And he was born in 1838, but immigrated in 1856 and first settled in the town of Blooming Grove. And he didn't own any land at that time. He was a farm laborer just trying to earn some money. And for 5 years he was doing that. And for 5 years in the winters, he would go up north and work in the pine forest, helping to decimate the pine forests up there by chopping down all the pine trees. But he gained enough money that he was able to marry in 1861 Bertha, or sometimes she went by Betsy Anderson, and she was born in 1830, and she came to the United States in 1854. And they had 6 children, and the youngest was Ellen. And this was really unusual for that time of history, that she was a graduate of the University of Wisconsin and became a school principal in Waukesha County. And so I find that very interesting. And another child of theirs was John, and he became a long-time store operator and postmaster in McFarland. And so we'll learn more about him August 1st. But Sher Johnson, in about 1864, 1865, purchased some land just south of McFarland. Basically, it's McFarland today, but back then it wasn't. But it's from Bashford Street and the first block of Creamery, everything south towards Mud Lake. That was the Sher Johnson farm. And so it was about 117 acres that he farmed. And so in the late 1890s, early 1900s, he started selling off some of the property that is now along Exchange Street. So a lot of those houses on the east side of Exchange Street were in the Sher Johnson addition to McFarland. And so he made money doing that, and he made, I think he did some carpentry work, so he made money doing that besides farming. But he was also a member of the Town of Dunn Board for 2 terms, and the town treasurer for 2 years, and he was a census enumerator for the 1880 census. And he was the treasurer for the McFarland Lutheran Church for 20 years. And for a while he was employed by both houses of the Wisconsin State Legislature. I'm not sure exactly doing what, but I'm sure during the winter years, or the winter months, that the farming wasn't something you could do. He would find jobs elsewhere. And one interesting thing is, since he was here in the 1860s, 1864, 65, when he bought that land, the first McFarland Lutheran Church was started in 1867. And it was destroyed in a windstorm in 1881. So a second church had to be built, and that second church burned down in 1895. And so a third church had to be built, and that was built across the street. But Sher Johnson helped build all 3 churches. And the reason why they built the third church across the street is because by 1896, the cemetery had surrounded the church, and they needed a bigger church, and so they had boxed themselves in to be able to build a larger church. And so they bought the land across the street, and they bought the land next door, so that bluish gray house was the first parsonage for the McFarland Lutheran Church. Prior to 1900, McFarland shared a minister with Stoughton, and so we never had a full-time minister here, and the minister never lived here until 1900 when Pastor Brandt arrived. But one thing you want to know about Sher Johnson, and you all know about him, but so you know the street name Sher and you know the street name Johnson, right? Going up to the grade school and then the street along the grade school. That was because that's where his land was. And then he died in 1907, and then the farm went to a man called Christ Johnson. And I don't think they were related. I can't figure out if they were, but if they just shared the same last name. But then after Christ Johnson, the farm went to Carroll Johnson, a man, but again, I don't know how they're related, but all the years of that farm, it was owned by a Johnson, which is interesting. And then Carroll Johnson, when he retired, that land was sold to a developer in 1975, and that's the housing development past the grade school is where the Johnson farm was. And then the silo house, you probably are aware of the silo house. That was the silo of that farm. I don't know exactly when the silo was built, but that's the farm.
Is that the house with the tower?
Yeah. And then the Sher Johnson house is still there. The older house, the only old house in that neighborhood, it was built in 1875. And it's on the McFarland landmarks, one of the 19 properties that's a local landmark. Okay, now we'll take a little hike, not too far though, to our next group, and I'll need help on this one. All right. There are a couple people in the audience who are familiar with these next couple of monuments. We have Johannes and Grow Ellisted. And so Johannes was born in Norway, in Valdres, Norway in 1805, and Grow was born there in 1817. They married in Norway and had several children, and then immigrated to the United States in 1848. And they went to, well, one interesting aspect of their immigration experience is that they set sail from Bergen and arrived in New York City on July 4th. And I think they were impressed by the celebration that was going on. And so, but this was after a 2-month journey, you know, going from Bergen to New York. So it had to take a toll, but they eventually made their way to Blooming Grove, where they purchased a tract of wild land in section 23. It was heavily wooded and had never been cultivated, so it took a lot of work. And but with the timber that Johannes was cutting down, he made a log cabin for the family. And but they started farming, and then Milwaukee was the closest market at that time. You could take things to Madison, but there's no way to get grain or wheat out of Madison except by wagon. So a lot of the pioneers just took their ox cart, filled it with their grain or wheat, and drove it to Milwaukee. And it was a 2-week trip. It took 1 week to get there and 1 week to get back. This is the late 1840s and early 1850s. And so there are no roads, basically. There are no bridges across the Crawfish River or the Rock River. They had to figure out the shallow parts of it. They would get stuck in the mud, and they would have to unload the wagon and get the ox to pull the wagon out and then carry the cargo back to the wagon and reload it. So it was not an easy task for anybody in those days to just make a living, but they did it, which is amazing. They could survive it. And so, you know, they'd get their grain there, and it would be ground into flour and to feed, and they would they would take that back home, and then some of it would be sold for cash, which they would use to buy supplies or various goods. And so, it was just, an arduous life. But Grow, and I understand sometimes she went by Grace. Do you know? Okay. but Grow, G-R-O, but sometimes went by Grace, and Johannes sometimes went by John. But Grow, like all immigrant women, made a lot of the clothes. She carded the wool, she spun the yarn, and she had a loom that she could weave the clothing, so she made most of the clothing. And Johannes was a shoemaker in Norway. He learned the trade before he immigrated, and so he made all the kids' shoes. And so they just got by like all the immigrants and pioneers. They had to do it themselves. There's no store around to go buy things. And so over the years, more and more land was purchased, and by at the peak time, I understand that they had owned 400 acres. You agree with that? Okay, good. But the other amazing thing about Grow and Johannes is their legacy. They had 11 children. 8 of them survived before Grow and Johannes died, and they had 85 grandchildren. 70 of the 85 survived the lifetime of Grow and Johannes, and they had 69 great-grandchildren. And at the time of their deaths, they had 1 great-great-grandchild. But there were 2 sons, Nelson and John, who divided the homestead, and a 3rd son. They had more than that, but a 3rd son fought in the Civil War, Peter. But Peter, after the war, moved to Iowa. But the interesting thing, both John and Nels were mentioned in this book on the history of Dane County, and there's a 2-volume set, and one's on the biographies of important people in Dane County. And both John and Nels Ellisted are mentioned in the biographies. And one thing about John, it said that he gained prominence and success as one of the progressive farmers of Blooming Grove, where he had accumulated extensive land estate. And he was a man of intelligence, well informed in regard to the affairs of the day. And so he had bought the over 200 acres, and it said that he manifested much energy and ambition, while he so ordered his life as to retain at all times the unqualified esteem and confidence of his fellow men, while his interests were centered in his home and family, where his noble character showed forth in its brightest form. Isn't that a nice tribute? And then Nels, Nels and John are both buried around here as well, and I think this one here is John, and Nels might be over here. But for Nels, it said also one of the prominent farmers and honored and influential citizens of Blooming Grove, and in 1861 he married Anna Nelson, who was also born in Norway. So I think that those biographies say a lot about the early immigrant and how they just really were hard-working people who tried to make a better life for them and their family. And another interesting thing about this biography of Dane County, it's at the public library in their history room. And I was looking through it, and here there's a name in the cover written that somebody had owned it. You know who that is? Milo Edwards. Pat's dad.
That's my dad.
So I don't know who donated it, but I'm very appreciative because it's a wonderful resource for local history. All right, now we'll, or
Ron, how are elves
yes, yes,
Are they the
yes.
are they?
Well, you go ahead if you want to say.
I think Nelson and John were my grandpa's cousins, were on that side.
Yeah.
But I know there's stories about my great-grandma, that my grandma has a scrapbook that she made that in the 1930s. There was an article about she would feed the Indians when they came around and were hungry.
Yeah.
And how many people she fed at her door without any payment or anything.
Yeah.
And they would mark the houses sometimes, and they would make a mark on a fence that those people were nice and gave them food and were kind to them.
Yeah.
So if they came through again or other ones coming through, they would know that that would be a house they could stop at. And
Yeah.
maybe get food. And,
Like a safe house or something. Sure.
But I have. Oh, okay. Well, this is Jim Ellisted and his sister Betty Kelhagen, and so they're part of that rich family history that's here. And they said that it was your grandma in 1930 had a scrapbook.
Yeah.
So there was a family scrapbook in the 1930s that mentioned different things, and one was how the Indians in the area would come to the house and ask for food, and the Ellisted family would supply that with asking for no payment, and so the Indians knew it was a house where they could receive food or drink, and so they found them to be very kind and helpful, and so the house or the barn or a fence post was marked so other Indians coming through would know this is a house that can be trusted. But I have this, I have your family tree, because I thought maybe you might be here. But so Johannes and Grow Ellisted, and then there was John Ellisted and Annie, and then there was one of his sons was Evan.
That's my grandpa.
Yeah, and Tilda was your grandma. Yeah, Even, and then Curtis, your dad,
My dad.
and your mom Margaret Olsmo, and we'll talk about the Olsmo on August 15th. And then it's Jim, Markin, and Betty, and so their grandchildren are the seventh generation of the family in this area, from Blooming Grove and McFarland. So I think it's one of the oldest families in terms of longevity in this area. So, and I have to add, the nice tributes that were written about the Ellisteds early on. It hasn't changed. So, as far as I know. Well, the next family we're going to talk about is the Olsen family, but they went sometimes by the last name of Fossheim. So it's Talib Olsen Fossheim. And that's another thing I should mention about the Norwegian immigrants. Like the Ellisteds, they kept their name from where they came. The Norwegians had different names. They had the first name, and then their second name, like Larson or Johnson or Olsen, and then the third name was the farm where they came from or the location where they came from. And quite often it was a different sounding word for the Americans, and so quite often the Norwegians would drop that, like Fossheim for Talib Olsen. They eventually dropped that because it was maybe too hard to pronounce, so they just went with Olsen. But the Ellisteds kept their place name, and another well-known one is Elvium. That was their place name in Norway, and when they came here, they kept it rather than keeping the Larson or Johnson or Anderson name. So Talib Olsen Fasheim, with his wife Ingeborg, they came to the United States Talib did in 1848, and while he was here, he married Ingeborg in 1858, and they had 6 children. And Talib Olsen was one of the richest farmers in the area. He was in the town of Dunn, towards Lake Eganza, between AB and Highway 51 right now. That's where his farm is located, down by Kiganza. And at one time he had 1,000 acres. And eventually, by the time he died, it was down to 700. But he was known to be a shrewd businessman, where he would negotiate a lot with anything. He'd just go to the store and he would negotiate for a bag of nails. So they said he was very shrewd, but that's how he made his money. But mostly he made his money through real estate transactions. So he, in 1901, when he was 70 years old, he and his wife Ingeborg moved off the farm and into McFarland. And he purchased a house in town from E.N. Edwards, but Ingeborg died a couple years later in 1904. Talib then moved to Stoughton to live with a daughter, Tilla, who's here mentioned. And but after Talib died in 1910, the estate sold the house in 1911 to John Larson, and we know that house now is the Larson House, where the museum is on the corner of Exchange and Bashford. So the official name is the Edwards Larson House, and Ian is a great uncle of yours, of Pat's, and so Talib Olsen lived there for a few years, and then, even though he was a shrewd businessman, he did donate land to the Daly or Hillside School, which was on Dearson Road, I believe, and so but that was built in 1878, and one of his descendants, Turahole Graber, was big supporter of McFarland history and the McFarland Historical Society and the Larson House Museum. If you go into the Larson House Museum, you'll see a chapter or something on the wall or a room dedicated to Talib Olsen Fasheim. And now we're almost to the next one, Ole and Brita Dearson. This is the large Dearson monument, but there are Dearsons all around here. And so Ole Dearson was born in 1821, and he immigrated from Norway in 1851. And like the Ellisteds, it was mentioned that he was very hospitable to the Indians who camped in the woods south of Lower Mud Lake along the Yahira River, and they helped themselves to Ole's corn and salt pork, and it said that the Indians grieved when Ole died because he was so kind to him. But the Ole Dearson farm, if you're familiar with Dearson Road, if you go out AB and take a right, and there's Dearson Road, and his farm is just before the Dearson Bridge on the north side, and that location along the river is one of the greatest archaeological sites for Native American artifacts in Wisconsin. The dig has found artifacts from Paleo Indians 9,000 years ago, spear points, all the way up through the various Native American groups up to the Ho-Chunk 150 years ago. And so it's a very valuable location, and it was very special to the Native Americans, that location. So having the Indians there and wanting to be there is no surprise, because it was still important to them in the late 1800s. But so Ole Dearson welcomed them. He let them be part of his farmland. You go out AB towards Lake Eganza, and you turn right on Dearson. It's like it has a special sign about it's a heritage road or something. And then just before you get to the bridge, the farm on the right is the Dearson homestead.
Another interesting story about the artifacts. Right now the Yahara is so low. It's one of the first times you can actually see one of 5 fish weirs in the whole state of Wisconsin. You can see it because the water's really clear and it's very low. And it's just to the right of the bridge.
Okay.
Just before you go over the Dearson Bridge.
Okay.
It's amazing to be able to see it.
Yeah, that'd be worth a trip there. Thanks. And so, as you can tell, Dearson Road and Dearson Bridge were named after Ole and his family. There were a couple sons or 3 sons, Bricht and David. This is David and his family, and Bricht is here, or up here, and another son, Louis, is buried here. But there's an interesting story about David, Ole's son David and Louis. They came to town, I think it was 1924, to unload a wagon full of tobacco along the tracks. There was a tobacco warehouse across from where the north entrance to Elvium School is. There was a tobacco warehouse there, but the Edwards Brothers Hardware also had a tobacco warehouse, so I'm not sure which tobacco warehouse they were unloading the tobacco. And but they were on the track side of the building. And so they had horses, 2 horses pulling this wagon, and the wagon was pushed up against the building. And Louis could not hear and he could not speak, but he was there helping his brother David unload the tobacco. And because Louis could not hear, he didn't hear the train coming. And the horses heard it, and it spooked the horses, and so they jumped. And they unfortunately jumped on the tracks. The train hit them, killed both horses, but Louis and David escaped serious injury. But then the sad thing is, 12 years later, if that's not sad enough, but 12 years later, Louis lived in town. Then he had moved to town. Again, he was older, couldn't hear. He was walking home, didn't hear the train, and he was hit by a train, killed by the train in 1936. So unfortunate set of circumstances there for the Dearson family. Bricht Dearson married Hattie Dearland, and the Dearlands we spoke about earlier with the calendar stick. And so Hattie inherited that calendar stick, and then it was passed on to her daughters. And so the interesting thing about this community, just like any rural community, you didn't go anywhere. This is where you were, this is where you lived, and so you married people from the area. And so you'll find that around in the cemetery. There's so many families that are interconnected by marriage. It makes it hard to keep things straight.
How did the Dearson and the Scary, what's that connection?
Yeah. Robert Scary. Robert Scary is the youngest son of Ole Scary, who's the brother to Albert and he married a Dearson girl.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. And we'll be talking about the Scaries in a moment. And we're kind of going to walk back to where we started. I mentioned how, we're going to be talking about mostly Norwegians, but Willie McFarland was one exception, and now here's the other exception, a non-Norwegian. It's John and Marianne Shetter, and they were both born in Pennsylvania, and they came to the state in 1845. And John Shetter was a blacksmith, and so he started up a blacksmith shop in the town of Cottage Grove and did that for about 4 years. And then he thought he would be a farmer, and he bought 160 acres in the town of Pleasant Springs. But it turned out he didn't like that much. He liked blacksmithing. So he sold the farm, and he moved to McFarland, where he set up a blacksmith shop from 1852 until 1870. And his sons assisted him quite a bit with blacksmithing in town. And two of his sons fought in the Civil War, but they're not buried here. They're both buried in Stoughton. But a son-in-law to John and Marianne was killed, or wasn't killed, he died in the Civil War. Like the majority of soldiers in the Civil War, he died from disease. And he died in Louisiana. And I'm figuring he must be buried down there. I don't have any records of him up here, but his wife, Sarah, is buried next to her parents, John and Marianne Shetter. All three of them are not buried in this cemetery, but they're buried in the upper cemetery. And that's where the non-Norwegians were buried at that time. Because McFarland had a Methodist church from the 1880s until the 1930s. And the Shetters went to the Methodist church, and for a while, that cemetery, the upper cemetery, was called the Methodist Cemetery, because that's where the Methodists were buried. But then after the Methodist church disbanded in the 1930s, it became another cemetery for Norwegians and anybody else to be buried. So it doesn't go back as far as this cemetery, but you can have a few up there who died in the 1890s, and then it's going forward. One sad thing about the Shetter family, one of their sons, Henry, was severely wounded in the Civil War, but he came back and managed to raise a family. But one of his granddaughters drowned in Lake Wabisa. Her name was Amelia in 1872, or a granddaughter of John Shetter, a daughter of Henry. But it's unknown if there was foul play, because a lot of the witnesses, when they were trying to locate her, they were interviewing people, and some people claimed that they heard screams from a young woman during the time of her disappearance. And a month later, she was found in Lake Wabisa. So no one really knows what happened to her. And so now we're going to have our last family that we'll talk about. Well, we're going to end up with the Skari family, and Ole and Ragnhild Skari. And they immigrated from Telemark, Norway, to McFarland. Well, Ole did in 1853 with his parents, and then Ragnhild came with her parents from Telemark to the Kashkanang area. And so they were married at the West Kashkanang Church in 1866, again before there was a McFarland church. And they made their home and raised their children on a farm on what is now Hidden Farm Road. And if you've ever gone down Hidden Farm Road all the way, you'll see that homestead there. And it's the Skaris had a log cabin where they raised all their kids. And that log cabin now is at the back of the McFarland Historical Society on Main Street. And so if you've ever been to the museum, and you've been in the cabin, you'll be aware that how difficult it must have been to have 8 people living in that cabin, a small little place, but they did that until the 1890s, and then they built the house that's standing there now on the farm. But the interesting thing about the Skari family, they had a number of kids, but one of their sons, Elbert, was the one who took over the farm, and he and his wife lived there for many years, and they farmed it, but they never had kids. And so that original log cabin that was used by the family for many years wasn't torn down. It was kept on the farm, and somehow they got a second log cabin there. So there are 2 log cabins on the property. And Elbert loved to collect things, and all the Norwegian tools and implements that he knew as a kid that he saw his father using, he kept them. He didn't want to throw anything out, so he kept all of his father's stuff. He'd go to auctions and he would buy other things, and he would just stuff them in the cabins. And so by the time he died, both cabins were filled to the gills with all these things that Elbert found special, that reminded him of his childhood and of his heritage. And so what to do with this after he died? Well, because he didn't have any children, a niece of his went to the McFarland's Historical Society board. The McFarland's Historical Society was founded in 1964, and Elbert, who's buried here, died in 1967. And so the McFarland's Historical Society didn't have a museum at that time. And so the niece came to the Historical Society board and said, if you promise to build a museum, we'll give you all this stuff. And so that was the impetus of the McFarland's Historical Society Museum, was the Elbert Skari collection. And there were over 1,100 items that they took out of the cabins and brought to the museum. And I think they've, finished the museum in 1973 or 74, and that's how it got started. So I think it's appropriate to end the tour that focused on Norwegian immigration and settlers to end with Elbert, who keeps the story alive with his artifacts in the McFarland's Historical Society. So that's the quick history of these 10 families, even though there are probably 300 people buried here, and so there are a whole lot more stories that could be told, but these are the ones that are known. And so I appreciate your attention and listening. Thank you.